Every decision you believe is yours was designed to feel that way before you ever encountered it. Sit with that, not as a metaphor, not as philosophy. As a mechanical fact about the architecture of the world you navigate every single day. You wake up and you make choices: what to consume, what to believe, who to trust, what to want. And somewhere beneath the surface of that experience, beneath the sensation of agency, beneath the feeling of preference, there is a layer of engineering you were never supposed to see. A substrate, a foundation poured before you arrived. This is not a conspiracy. Conspiracies require secrets. What we are describing requires only design. Imagine a probability space. In mathematics, a probability space contains every possible outcome, every state the system could theoretically occupy. Now imagine that someone, before you enter that space, has already collapsed the vast majority of outcomes, has already made certain states nearly unreachable, has weighted the remaining options so that your movement through the space follows a predictable gradient. You still move. You still choose, but you are not navigating an open field. You are navigating a topology that was sculpted in advance. The hills and valleys of that landscape determine where you flow, the same way water does not choose its path down a mountain. It simply follows the geometry someone else built. The masses experience this landscape as reality, as the natural shape of things. They do not feel the hand that graded the terrain, because the hand was removed long before they arrived. This is the first principle of the consent algorithm. The most effective control system is one that requires no active enforcement. It runs passively. It runs on the choices of the controlled. The architect does not stand over you. The architect builds the room and leaves. You do the rest. Consider what it means to manufacture consent at scale. Not through coercion. Coercion is expensive. Coercion requires ongoing energy. It generates resistance. It leaves marks. No. The operator understands something far more elegant. If you can shape the information environment upstream, before the belief forms, you never need to correct the belief downstream. You simply never allow the competing belief to achieve critical mass. Information theory gives us a useful frame here. Every signal competes against noise. But noise is not neutral. Noise can be engineered. If the architect controls the signal-to-noise ratio of an idea, if the architect can flood the channel with low-fidelity alternatives, with distortions, with just enough complexity to exhaust the receiver, then the signal never lands with enough clarity to reorganize behavior. You do not suppress the truth. You make the truth computationally expensive to hold. You make doubt feel like work. You make certainty feel like rest. And then you decide which certainties are available. The masses do not know they are tired. They only know that some ideas feel heavy and others feel like relief. They move toward the relief every time, because that is what the gradient was designed to produce. This is not cynicism. This is architecture. And here is where the ground shifts beneath everything you think you understand. The most sophisticated version of this system does not require the architect to be malicious. It does not require intent in the way you imagine intent. The system, once built, optimizes itself. The executor follows the incentive structure. The boardroom follows the executor's results. The masses follow the boardroom's outputs. No single point of control, no villain in a room. Just a recursive loop, a feedback algorithm running on human behavior. Self-reinforcing, self-correcting. Mistaken by its participants for the neutral operation of a free world. You are not being lied to by a person. You are being processed by a system that learned, long ago, that the most efficient lie is the one that teaches you to lie to yourself. Now ask yourself this, and hold the question, because part 2 will demand that you have held it. If the architecture of your choices was built before you arrived, if the terrain was graded, the signal filtered, the gradient set, then what exactly is the thing you call your opinion? Is it yours? Or is it the output the system was always going to produce from the input that you are? That question is not rhetorical. It is a diagnostic. Because the answer you arrive at, the speed at which you dismiss it, the discomfort it produces, the reflex to reassert your own sovereignty, all of that is data. All of that is the system responding to a probe. Watch your own reaction. It is telling you something about the depth of the architecture inside you. Part 1 gave you the topology, the graded terrain, the sculpted probability space. Now we go deeper. Now we look at the mechanism itself. There are 2 principles at the operational core of the consent algorithm. The architect does not need to deploy both simultaneously. But when both are active, when they are layered, the system becomes something close to airtight. The first is what we will call the principle of preemptive saturation. The operator does not wait for you to encounter a dangerous idea and then suppress it. That is reactive. That is expensive. That is the crude version of control, the version that leaves fingerprints. Preemptive saturation works differently. Before the signal arrives, the operator floods the channel, not with silence, with volume, with adjacent noise that mimics the signal's frequency closely enough that the receiver, you, cannot easily distinguish the original from the distortion. The idea still reaches you, but it reaches you pre-digested, pre-framed, pre-neutralized. It arrives wearing a costume the operator designed. You think you are encountering the raw idea. You are encountering its controlled release. The masses never know the difference because they have no access to the unfiltered version. They have only ever seen the costume. They evaluate the costume and conclude, this idea is not what I was looking for, and they move on. The operator does not need to ban the idea. The operator simply makes the idea unrecognizable to the people it was meant to reach. This is the first principle, preemptive saturation, flood before the signal, distort before the reception, control the frame before the picture arrives. The second principle is what we will call the principle of manufactured adjacency. This one is subtler, more elegant, more dangerous. The boardroom understands that humans do not evaluate ideas in isolation. They evaluate ideas in context. They evaluate ideas in relation to the ideas that surround them. This is not a flaw in human cognition. It is a feature, a necessary heuristic for navigating a world of infinite information with finite processing capacity. You are not stupid for doing this. You are efficient, but efficiency has an exploit. If the architect controls what surrounds an idea, if the architect controls the adjacency map, then the architect controls the meaning of the idea without ever touching the idea itself. You can take a true thing and make it feel false simply by placing it next to the right neighbors. You can take a false thing and make it feel true by giving it credible company. The kingmaker does not rewrite the text. The kingmaker rewrites the table of contents. The kingmaker decides what comes before and what comes after. And in that sequencing, in that editorial architecture, the meaning shifts. The gradient shifts, and you, moving through the information landscape, feel the shift as intuition, as instinct, as your own judgment arriving at its own conclusion. It was not your conclusion. It was the conclusion, the adjacency map, was always going to produce. Preemptive saturation, manufactured adjacency, these are not theories. These are operational protocols. They are running right now in every information environment you inhabit. Now let us make this concrete. Let us watch the mechanism operate in real time. Imagine a room, not a physical room, a conceptual one, an information environment. A space where a particular idea has begun to gain traction. The idea is simple, structurally sound. And if it were to achieve critical mass, if enough of the masses were to hold it with sufficient clarity, it would reorganize behavior in ways the boardroom cannot afford. The executor receives the signal, not an order. The executor does not need orders. The incentive structure is sufficient. The executor understands, through the logic of the system, what needs to happen. First, preemptive saturation. Within the same information environment, a cascade of adjacent content appears. Some of it is superficially similar to the original idea, close enough to attract the same audience, different enough to dilute the core. Some of it is deliberately extreme, a louder, more radical version of the idea that functions as a repellent. That makes the original idea guilty by proximity. Some of it is simply volume, noise at scale, the channel fills. The person who was beginning to hold the idea, who was beginning to feel its structural integrity, beginning to sense that it reorganized something important, now encounters it surrounded by distortions. They cannot isolate the signal. They are fatigued by the effort of filtering. And fatigue, as Part 1 established, is a gradient. The masses flow away from effort. They flow toward clarity. The operator provides the clarity, the operator's version of clarity. Then manufactured adjacency. The original idea. In the few places, it still appears in something close to its original form, is now placed in proximity to concepts the audience has already been conditioned to distrust. It is not attacked directly, it is simply neighbored. The table of contents is rewritten. And the audience, applying their efficient heuristic, evaluating ideas in context, feels something shift. The idea that felt structurally sound now feels contaminated. Feels like something they would not want to be associated with. They retreat. They self-select away from it, no suppression, no coercion, no marks left. The masses made their own choice. They moved through the landscape the architect built. They followed the gradient. They arrived exactly where the system needed them to arrive. And they will remember it as the moment they thought critically, as the moment they evaluated the evidence and made up their own minds. This is the mechanism. This is what is running beneath the surface of every information environment you have ever trusted. And now the question that Part 3 will force you to answer. If you can see the mechanism, if you can name the principles, trace the topology, identify the gradient, does that seeing change anything? Or is the awareness itself already accounted for? Is the architect sophisticated enough to have built a room for the people who find the room? Yes. The architect is sophisticated enough to have built a room for the people who find the room. This is not defeatism. This is the third principle, the one the first two were always protecting. And understanding it is the difference between someone who has read about the maze and someone who has begun to map the walls from the inside. Hold that distinction. It matters more than anything that came before it. Every sophisticated control architecture contains a release valve, a designated space for descent, a corridor that appears to lead outside the building but terminates, after sufficient distance, in another interior. This is not a flaw in the system. It is the system's most elegant feature. Because the architect understands something about pressure. A sealed system accumulates it. Pressure without a release mechanism becomes unpredictable. It finds its own exits, and those exits are not controlled. So the operator engineers the exit. The operator builds the corridor. The operator places the door exactly where the pressure is most likely to push. And the people who push through that door, the ones who pride themselves on having escaped, on having seen through the architecture, on having named the mechanism, they enter a room that was built for them specifically. A room calibrated to their cognitive profile. A room that feels like the outside, because it was designed by someone who studied what the outside looks like to people like them. The masses consume the first layer of the system without question. The aware consume the second layer, the critique, the exposure, the revelation, and believe they have exited. The architect loses no sleep over either group. Both are accounted for. Both are inside the topology. This is the recursive trap. Awareness of the system is not immunity to the system. Awareness is simply admission to a higher security ward. But here is what the architect does not tell you, because the architect benefits from you not knowing it. The trap is recursive, but it is not infinite. Every system has a computational boundary. Every feedback loop has a latency. Every control architecture, no matter how sophisticated, operates on a model of the agent it is controlling. And a model is not the agent. A model is a compression, a lossy representation. It captures the statistical behavior of the masses with extraordinary precision, but it captures the individual with decreasing accuracy as the individual deviates from the model distribution. This is the asymmetry that remains. The system is optimized for the average vector of human behavior. It is not optimized for the agent who has internalized the system's own logic and begun operating outside the predicted distribution. You cannot exit the topology by wanting to exit. Wanting is already modeled. You cannot exit by being angry about the system. Anger is already modeled. You cannot exit by sharing this information with others. Viral descent is already modeled. It is, in many cases, engineered. You exit, to whatever degree exit is possible, by making decisions the model did not predict, by introducing genuine noise into your own behavioral signal, by becoming, in the language of information theory, a source of entropy the system cannot efficiently compress. The architect controls the gradient. The architect does not control the agent who has stopped following gradients. There is one category of signal the operator finds genuinely expensive to neutralize. Not impossible, expensive. It is the signal that originates from first principles reasoning applied to direct, unmediated observation. Not information consumed from a channel, any channel including this one. Not ideas received from an environment the architect had access to before you did, but conclusions derived from the raw data of your own direct experience, processed through structural logic you have built yourself, tested against reality in ways that produce feedback the system did not generate. This is expensive to neutralize because it does not travel through the channels the operator controls. It does not pass through the adjacency map. It does not arrive pre-framed. It emerges from inside the agent. From a process, the operator can model statistically, but cannot intercept in real time at the individual level. The boardroom is not afraid of people who know the system exists. The boardroom is cautious about people who have developed the internal architecture to generate unmediated signal, and who act on it with structural consistency, outside the predicted behavioral distribution, at a scale the model did not anticipate. That is the narrow gate. That is what the corridor of controlled descent was built to prevent you from finding. Now you know where it is. Knowledge without protocol is another form of saturation. So here is what you do with what you now hold. First, signal isolation. Before you form an opinion on any idea that matters, trace its origin. Not the source that delivered it to you. That source is already inside the adjacency map. Trace the structural logic of the idea itself. What does it require to be true? What does it predict? What would falsify it? Evaluate the architecture of the idea independent of the environment in which you encountered it. Strip the costume, find the underlying claim. Test it against your own direct observation before you test it against anything the information environment provides. The agent who evaluates structure before context is the agent the model is least equipped to predict. Second, behavioral entropy injection. Systematically introduce unpredictability into your decision, patterns in domains the system monitors. Not random behavior for its own sake, structured deviation. Make choices that are coherent with your actual values, but inconsistent with the behavioral profile the system has built from your historical signal. Change the channels you consume, change the sequence, change the timing. Seek primary sources the operator had less opportunity to pre-frame. The system's model of you degrades in proportion to the entropy you introduce into your own signal. And a degraded model produces less accurate gradient engineering. Third, output before input. Before you consume any external framing on a question that matters to you, write down your current first principles position. Not what you believe, what you can structurally derive from what you have directly observed. Then consume, then compare the delta. The gap between your pre-consumption derivation and your post-consumption conclusion is a direct measurement of the gradient's effect on your cognition. Run this protocol consistently, and you will begin to see, with precision, exactly where the operator's hand is moving your thinking and by how much. Visibility of the gradient is the first condition of not following it. The architect built a world in which your compliance is the energy source. Every belief you hold that the system designed, every gradient you follow that the operator graded, every conclusion you reach that the adjacency map produced, all of it powers the loop. The loop is self-sustaining because you are self-sustaining it. You are either the architect of your own cognition or you are its resource. There is no third position. Subscribe to AXIOM protocol.